So this is Laravel, some Shifty bits, and that is not a pun on shitty bits. So you all know me. I'm Jason McCreary. I go by JMac. I'm the creator of Laravel Shift. Hopefully a few of you have used that. Author of base code, and recently turned that into a podcast co-host with Jess Archer, who's out there somewhere. That was so quiet. Come on. Anyways, so Laravel Shifty bits. Basically what I'm doing here is combining Laravel by the numbers, which I gave last year at Laracon. I got a lot of great feedback on that, sharing analytical data about Shift. But I also got a lot of great feedback on my Laracon online talk by sharing code samples. So today I want to focus more on the code samples. So we're going to kind of explore some pieces of the framework that, again, from the Shift analytics, it doesn't appear that you're using, and so maybe there needs to be a little education around it. So I'm going to kind of consider myself Indiana JMac. This isn't a far stretch necessarily because I was raised in Indiana. I went to school in Indiana, so it's a fun nickname. And I think at one point in time, someone said that I looked like a young Harrison Ford, which was a super compliment in my opinion because he was my childhood hero. It's also a nice retro throwback to the retro theme that we have. So real quick, it's PG-13. This isn't necessarily, I know some of you all are doing some like kinky X-rated stuff with Laravel, and I might not necessarily cover those bits. So I'm trying to have something for everyone in here. So this is PG-13. And with that, I think I have 26 minutes left, so I'm doing well. All right, so Laravel is an MVC framework. Let's start with models. One of the things that doesn't seem to be used very often is casting, and this is attribute casting. And so what this looks like is inside your models, there's a property that's available for you to use and use cast. And this is a key value array where you can basically specify the columns and then the PHP data type that you want them to be. So in this case, we have a foreign key for a user on our settings, right? And we have an active bit, for example, that needs to be a Boolean value. And this way, these are casted when they come out of the database. Now, that's normally not an issue if we look at an example. So if kind of looking at this top part, when we retrieve this with Eloquent, we'll see that we get a 1 and we get false. But maybe in the database, that active in MySQL, for example, is just a tiny int, so it's saved as a literal 0 or a literal 1. But now I'm actually, again, getting that casting happening underneath. And this is really helpful if you're interested in type hints or return types, or even just strict equality, which to the point of the next example, how many times have you set something maybe from request data, which by default is a string, and something didn't line up and you had kind of just like some weird behavior in your code, right? Because you were using strict equality. Well, that's because of this type casting. So with this, you can actually set that up. You can cast these appropriately. So again, you don't have to worry about that. Even when you set this, it's 5, not the string 5. And you can set it to 1, and it'll still end up being the Boolean true. So simple stuff, but can be very helpful. I know I've tracked down a few bugs like that before. There's also more complex types as well, like array. This works if you have a JSON field, for example. Oh, sorry about that. The front row is like, oh, I only have a few of those, I'm sorry. So if you have a JSON field or a text column, basically you can use array to cast those. Let me get that out of there, sorry. So before the cast, this would come back as a JSON encoded string, real nasty, and you do JSON decode or whatever, but with the casting, this can automatically happen for you where it's an array of 3 elements. So that all kind of works magically through casting. If you want to take that even farther, you can actually use collections, and then even farther than that, you can define this yourself. So if you create what's called accessors and mutators on these attributes, by convention, these are simple getters and setters, and they have a naming convention. So a get, then your column name, suffixed with attribute. And this gets the raw value from the database. You manipulate it whatever way you want. So if you want to do a value object, or in this case, I have a pipe delimited string, old school way we used to store stuff, I want to explode that into an array, right? So on the flip side, you're going to get that array value, and then you're going to put it in a format that the database is ready for. So again, we can see all this kind of happen. When it comes out of the database, even though it's a pipe delimited string in the database, it's going to be an array. We're able to manipulate that as an array, but it's ultimately going to be stored as that pipe delimited format again. So complex ways to do things there. You can define yourself if some of those core data types don't match up for you. Quick gotcha on this, though. We know that this is an array, and so we might think, OK, well, let's do some like overloading, right? Let's do some union operation on this where we say, OK, I want that 1, 2, 3 array, but I want to add 4 to it. You might think it's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what you would expect, right? But it's not. It's still 4, 5, 6. So there's some things that happen underneath the covers that are a bit magical. So you have to kind of work your way around this. So this isn't necessarily a limitation with Laravel. It's more so just kind of PHP design. So get ready, front row. I'm sorry. We have an options array. So the way to get around this is they don't explicitly define this. But if you notice right here, they're setting options to a temporary variable performing that special manipulation on it and then reassigning it back. So long story short, a temporary variable can get you around that issue. All right, let's talk about model relationships. So relationships are hard sometimes. So when we create a setting, a lot of the times what we do is end up directly mapping that by setting the foreign key to the ID of whatever the other object is. And this is what I kind of call direct mapping. But there's some fun methods that you can find that help you do this. So here's the direct mapping. But you can use in a belongs to relationship, you can use associate. And underneath the covers, Laravel will kind of put all that together for you, figuring out the right keys. If you customize the keys or you configure the keys differently, it's going to do all that for you. So it's just a little less hard coding. I find it a little more elegant. The belongs to maybe doesn't seem as interesting. There's also disassociate. But I think what's nice is in a many-to-many relationship, I find this to be pretty expressive. So the opposite side of this, where I'm actually assigning a setting to something or associating that to the user, there's attach and detach. So nice little expressive ways to do that where you don't have to map everything up yourself. And it goes beyond that. I think one of the last ones, I apologize, sync here, and there's also toggle. So this is actually going to take an array of the IDs that you want to map between, and whichever ones need to be added, it adds, and whichever ones need to be removed, it'll remove. So this sync's really powerful. Instead of having to loop over and do that logic yourself, you can just say, these are the ones that should be synchronized. So I really like these methods on associations, but again, they don't seem to be commonly used in projects. So pivots. So pivot table is kind of the name for that intermediary table or the bridge table when you have a many-to-many relationship. So keep that in mind here. We basically have a user and a team association. So if we kind of think of that relationship, a user can be on many teams and a team can have many users, right? So we have this many-to-many relationship back and forth. But I'm going to add some complexity there because there's an approval process built into that. I want to make sure that when someone's invited to a team, I can approve them. So think GitHub, for example, when you're invited to a team or a repository or an organization. We can do that with the belongs to many, right? That relationship part's pretty easy. But what's powerful here is this where pivot. We can start actually limiting that relationship in certain ways. So for example, from a user's perspective, I only want to show them the teams that they have been approved to be on, right? I don't want to show them all the teams. So there's a way for me to limit that through that in-between relationship, through that pivot relationship. And this approved column actually lives on there. We can take that even farther on the other side of this relationship, the team relationship. As an administrator of the team, I'm going to need to see additional details of that. So I can actually have that same belongs to relationship, but put additional bits of information I want to pull off of it. So in this case, I want the ID of that pivot table or that intermediary table. I also want that approved column so I can say, OK, go ahead and approve this person or remove them. I also want the timestamp columns to see when they join the team, for example. And I can take all that and throw it into an in-between model itself, or a pivot model. And here's what we're going to talk about. So think of this kind of like a cast, right? So we cast that into a model, a membership model. And this is kind of a superset of the model class. It's called a pivot. So it extends pivot, not necessarily model directly. And this allows us to do some additional pieces on it. So even though I'm following that intermediary table, I don't have like a memberships table. So even though I'm following this two-model, in alphabetical order naming convention that Laravel provides, I can map it here, even though it has a different model name. I can say I want to increment it, which allows me that direct syncing access I was demonstrating a second ago. I want that primary key on there, that incrementing key, so I can work with that more efficiently. And then finally, I want to go ahead and bind up the data between the two, because anytime I ever ask for a membership, I'm always going to want to know the user and the team information. So let's just go ahead and tack that on. And the relationships here are straightforward from this model's perspective. They're just belongs to the other things, right? But with this pivoting action, we can actually perform really, really complicated relationships, right? But we can break it down using these simple building blocks of just belongs to and has many. And this kind of throws me back to when I worked on Ruby on Rails a little bit more. I apologize, but they had a really cool thing in their documentation, and you probably won't be able to read it necessarily, but down here they talk about kind of a simple rule of thumb. And they say that a lot of the times, even though we want to reach for this has and belongs to many, or a belongs many through relationship, or these more complex relationships, you can often do that relationship and model it in a way that's much simpler and much more approachable. So again, keep these things in mind. Finally, if you are using a super complex relationship, the polymorphic relationship, for example, be sure you're using morph map. And this is important more so on the Shift perspective of maintaining your applications. The documentation mentions this a few times. What we're after here is decoupling the relationship between the database and the internal application structure. So a polymorphic relationship, or maybe a relationship you're doing yourself, you might store a reference to your model as one of the values for that record. And I'll get people that run the namespace shift, or they upgrade their app multiple versions, or they move their models to a models folder or out of a models folder, or whatever it might be. And then they're like, my application broke. And it's because that mapping is now incorrect. So you can map this yourself with morph map. So if you're using polymorphic relationships, or even building your own relationships underneath the covers, definitely make sure that you're using this morph map. It's just a key value pair of your table and whatever name you want to give that yourself. This reference is, or that value is up to you. So for example, I might use just kind of an inverted namespace that's simply model. I don't use app or anything of that nature. So it doesn't reflect my internal structure of the application. It just reflects a reference. All right, moving on to views. A lot of times with views, most people just scratch the surface with the blade directives. They only use ifs, unless, maybe for eaches and so forth, but there's all sorts of expressive blade directives. So each one of these has a counterpart inside of view. So for example, instead of if set or empty or checking for auth, you can actually use is set. You can use a empty directive. You can use auth. You can use guest. So basic things, but again, they're just not that commonly used, and I think they're much more expressive, and I don't have to reach across to facades or anything like that. It's all kind of just built in under the covers. Similarly, even though Laravel doesn't really integrate too much with HTML tags anymore, there are a few that it offers through blade directives. So these method spoofing or the CSRF token all come across as a blade directive. You can just use @method, pass it the HTTP verb you want, and then of course CSRF to get that same input. So you don't have to remember, is it underscore method or underscore token? It's all just kind of right there. And if you're doing any kind of iteration tracking inside of a loop, definitely check out the loop variable. It has all sorts of properties built into it, such as the total that you're on, how many remaining items you have, if it's the first iteration, the last iteration, an even iteration, an odd iteration, for zebra striping, for example. The depth, if you have multiple layers of for each loops, this is all built in. You don't have to track it yourself, build it yourself. You have direct access to it inside of your for each tag. So definitely keep that in the back of your mind. One quick bit on performance. I noticed this the other day when pairing with the company. They were trying to figure out, how can we make the application more performant, and they were focusing on database queries. And I thought this was kind of an interesting one that we tracked down. And it might not be readily apparent, but probably once I explain it, it's pretty obvious. When you have this view composers, it's a quick way to share data with your views. And so inside of here, you might just say, for example, give me all those settings, because there's a lot of different views in my application that use it. And this is quick, and this is easy, and it's great. But there's a downside to it. That actually runs for every single view of your application. So it runs not only for the view that you're rendering, but any views that are rendered as part of that view. So think layouts, partials, sidebars, headers, footers, 7 other times that query is run. So keep that in mind with your application, because if you have a very complex view hierarchy, which I think some applications do, you might be running this like 42 times. And you obviously don't want to do that with your query. So best way to take care of this is try to target that exact place that uses it, or target the highest level bit in your view hierarchy. So for example, the layout, and not necessarily all the little in-between wildcard bits. OK, instead of controllers, I want to talk about responses, because controllers ultimately respond with something. So I think there's more things we can cover here. Some bit of code that I never really like is this try-catch block. And I'll see this a lot inside of controllers. And just to kind of break it down for a second, it does something that can have some kind of exceptional behavior, right? So in this case, it's from Shift. I'm attempting to connect to GitLab, because GitLab requires Shift to be a collaborator on your project in order to open the PR. But this might, connecting to the client, throw some kind of exception. So I catch that exception. It's a custom exception that I defined. And then I do something special. In this case, I log out, so I know what happened. And then I redirect them back with the input to basically make sure that they try this again with some information. But again, I just don't like the overall structure of that. I already have this extra class that I made. I'm kind of breaking the logic. I don't like nested code. Talk about that in base code a little bit, but it's just ugly. I just also generally hate try-catch blocks. They're very dense syntax. So I already have this custom exception. And I think starting with Laravel 5.6, but definitely 5.7, you can actually, Laravel automatically looks for report or render methods inside of this class, this exception class. So think of your exception handler, how it has those report methods. And in the old days, we probably wrote 100 different if statements there to say, OK, if it's this type of exception, do this thing, and this thing, this thing. You can do that directly in your exception classes now. So in this case, I define that render, and I take that code that was in the controller, and I can pull it over here instead. So using report, if you have special reporting, you can have the report method as well. In this case, just demoing the render. And so now that controller can just simply be the thing that I want it to do, that custom business logic, and everything else can just roll up and be handled by the framework or the appropriate class that cares about that response anyways. So just a little cleaner. Form requests. Form requests are something that I really like, but I think sometimes developers don't add additional methods or take advantage of some things on them and end up, again, writing custom code that doesn't necessarily need to exist. So if you take a look at the form request class underneath, you can see that there are, for example, redirection properties where we can set a specific URI, we can set a redirect route, we can set a redirect action to a controller action. All these are available underneath the covers. So if I have some validation that doesn't pass for a particular form request, then instead of just going back, I can actually tell it where else to go. So just a very simple way to do that. But again, at first you might think, oh, I'm going to have to write some code, or I can't use a form request object, or just how do I do that with a form request? So, well, you can do that by just overriding one of those properties. So nice, clean way to do that. API responses are something else. This actually gets a little bit more into package that are used within applications. So for example, there's a lot of packages. Obviously, we know that the SPACY packages are very commonly used. But another one is Fractal, and that's kind of the one I want to mention here. And Fractal is a great package, but again, a lot of the times developers are only scratching the surface with that package by kind of just manipulating or formatting a response. And again, Laravel provides this for you automatically. So there's a JSON response that you can do underneath the covers, and it takes a toArray where you can format that model with key value pairs, format the value output, and then there's also ways to set additional things on that response. For example, headers, cookie values, whatever you might want to do. This is all built into the framework. And so again, if you're just kind of manipulating that response, the easy way to do that is create one of these new resources, you give it whatever model data, and it just figures out the rest for you. So I know Fractal is a very common one for that, and Fractal does way more than just this. But again, if you're only doing these things, you might want to check out just using Laravel directly. Authenticated. So authenticated is another area where people kind of bastardize the framework. They'll end up overriding this a lot. But Laravel provides tons of different hooks inside of their traits that are on the login controller, for example. This comes from the authenticates user trait. And what I'll see is developers take this and they overwrite it wholesale because they want to do something different with the authenticated user, or they want to do a different response. You have an opportunity to do that if you take a look kind of at this code. There's methods in here that you can overwrite. So there's credential methods that you can overwrite if you have maybe an approved field or whatever on your user. And in this case, there's an authenticated method that you can overwrite. And it takes the request, and it gets the authenticated user. And it gives you all the data that you need to be able to do the additional things you might want to do. But more importantly, if you return something from this method, you can also manipulate the response. So there's these very nuanced things inside of this that allow you to do very custom behavior without having to, again, overwrite this entire bit or write your own login controller. So definitely take a look at these. In this case, if I want to perform additional actions for login, I can override this authenticated method in my login controller, just this one surgical piece. And if I actually want to change the response, I don't want them to just redirect to whatever redirect path I set, then I can actually return something other than null here. And it's all just going to work out. Authorization. This is a big one that I probably stumbled on in the last little bit that I think that it can be really helpful, because authorization logic is something that's just kind of like littered throughout your entire application, and you're duplicating and repeating, and despite efforts to kind of abstract it, it ends up never really turning out the way you want. So let's take a look at this videos controller. There's this show method. And specifically, I have this ensure user can view video. Now, whether this is in your controller or your middleware or wherever you might end up doing it, the point is that there's custom authorization logic that lives here that kind of ends up doing something around that model data. So for example, if this is a free lesson, you can watch it, of course. And if it's a lesson that is part of your course that you bought, you can watch it, of course. Otherwise, we're going to abort with a 403. So it's a simple guard clause, but I've had to write a lot of extra code. And we can imagine that this doesn't just exist here. It exists elsewhere in the application, or it has similar things that focus off of being able to watch a video, right? So instead of this, I can actually use an authorization gate or policy. So Laravel offers both. I'm going to focus on gates. Gates are a little more generic, if you will, so generic gates. Policies map a bit better to models. So if you want authorization around CRUD operations, then policies are effectively the same thing, just kind of map directly to that model. So this gate, I can take that same custom logic that I had in my controller in this case, put it here, return true, obviously, if they're authorized to do that particular action, false otherwise. So my logic goes in this little closure. And I can give it a fun little name, in this case, watch video. And it lets me know if I can watch the video, then great. And in my code, instead of having, again, this logic that's likely elsewhere in the application, or if nothing else, just very dense, I can say something much more expressive with this gate facade and say gate allows watch video, and I can pass any additional parameters or data that I need to that closure. It automatically accepts the user, so notice that I don't need to pass that anymore. That's already pre-built into it. So it's any additional parameters. In this case, I want to know the video that you're trying to watch. From here, I can actually roll this up even tighter, right? Because now it kind of makes this abstraction that I've done myself irrelevant. So I can actually take that, roll it up, and put it in just its true guard clause, which is what it's meant to be, and just abort unless you're allowed to watch that video. So again, far more expressive code, all built in. And of course, it has blade directives. Yay! You have @can and cannot, and you can pass the same thing. And you can pass the data that you need to pass in and just tell it whatever particular guard or policy you want to do. So all expressive things. Finally, just to finish up, just a couple helpers that I think are pretty useful. One that I was using, if we think back to that teams and membership and users and joining a team, you might think that's pretty complex behavior, like how are we going to manage that process? Well, I ended up doing that with signed URLs, and this is something that's available, I think in 5.7 it became available, and there's also temporary signed URLs, which is pretty cool. So what I can do here is generate a URL that goes to a particular route. It lives for a certain amount of time, in this case 24 hours. And it has a particular bit of data that I want to be more or less encrypted. I want that to be secure in some way. I don't want someone just to be able to kind of fudge this request. I can now share this signed URL with whoever. So for example, the team administrator can now get this link, send it to whoever on their team they might want it, post it in Slack or whatever, and they're going to be able to click this and get right into this bit of the application and join the team. And I know because of the signed URL that if they tampered with any of the things, they tried to join a different team, or it was after it already expired, all that's going to be managed by the framework in this simple middleware for signed. So all of that's pre-built. I was able to accomplish all that, again, with just these helper methods that are all built into kind of Laravel that make sure everybody is aware of. So the final thing I want to end on are true helpers. I really like response and route chains. So let's just take a look and end with this real quick example here. So again, if you have some logic where you're saying if you're not authorized, then I want to respond with 403, forbidden. But it's just kind of ugly. It's response null, comma 403, the not auth. It's just all kind of nasty. So we can actually use a response chain. Again, there's all sorts of things here that just make this more expressive. So instead of saying null, I can say respond with no content of a status of 403. That's nice, but we can do a little better, as we've seen. So instead of that return and really dense line, we can just do abort, which is automatically going to cancel flow control. We're going to just send back that status code. And then we can even wrap that up even tighter to that guard clause we saw just a minute ago, where we say abort unless you are authorized with a 403. And there's other helpers like this, these flow control helpers. I'm a really big fan of these. Again, don't seem being used a whole lot, but there's abort unless, abort if, there's throw if, there's throw unless. So I think I have about 2 minutes. So I am at Gone Dark on Twitter. I have some things coming out in early August for Shift, obviously for the next version of Laravel, as well as a test generator Shift. So if you want to keep up on those, please follow me on Twitter, or you can subscribe to the newsletter at this bit.ly link. But otherwise, I will give way to the sponsors and to lunch. But I'm an attendee from here on out, so please come talk to me about Shift, about base code, about this talk. And thank you.